Hi, my name is Caitlin Canfield, and I'm going to do my presentation on the Sarabanes-Oxley Act of 2002, or the Corporate Responsibility Act. In my presentation, we're going to talk about what is the SOX Act, why did it come about, and what are the effects that we have seen because of the SOX Act. So to talk about what it actually is, let's talk about the attributes. There were two major things that the SOX Act brought about, and that was changes to accounting and changes to corporate responsibility. So with the accounting changes, first, they required more complete disclosures. So if there was anything that was not shown in a financial report, they wanted notes made to show things that weren't necessarily numbers, but were part of the situation. So for instance, if they knew that operations were probably going to tail off, they wanted that listed in a financial report so that the investors could take that information and make good decisions with it. Then they wanted internal controls. Internal controls were a protection that they put in place so that when bad things were happening in a company, fraudulent things, then internal controls could help minimize those things or report them to the necessary authority. The third thing that they did in accounting reporting was they wanted real-time disclosures. So if it wasn't in a reporting period, if it wasn't time for financial statements to come out, but something major happened, they made it the duty of the corporation to let their investors know. And this could be something like your CEO changes, or this could be something like, hey, something bad happened and we're bankrupt. This allowed investors to make real-time decisions instead of waiting until financial statements came out. Now, to talk about corporate responsibility, one of the biggest things that they did with corporate responsibility is they made the executive officers sign the disclosure statements and the financial statements. Normally, that's the CEO and the CFO. They both had to sign saying, yes, I have seen this. Yes, it is accurate. Yes, it is honest. And then if they found out that it was fraudulent, those liabilities rested on the CEO and the CFO. Whoever had signed it, that was their liability. So it made it really good for the CEO and the CFO to tell the truth. Now, in the case of fraud, the other thing that the SOX Act did was it put in place penalties. So for instance, if you knew fraud was occurring, but you still signed that paper and you tried to hide it, you could get up to a $5 million fine and or 20 years in prison. If you didn't know, but you should have because you signed and you said that you did know, you could get a $1 million fine and or 10 years in prison. Now, one of the great things that happened with this is that put a pretty high penalty on fraud, which their intent and really what happened was it lessened the amount of criminal action. So now to talk about why the SOX Act came into existence. 3 companies did some big things that really were not good for the financial world. The first was Enron. Enron was an energy company who, when they made deals that would give them future profits, instead of waiting for the profits to actually happen, they logged them as happening now. And that was called mark to market. Instead of doing like a cash basis or an accrual basis, they did, well, we think that this is going to be profitable in the future, so we're just going to log those profits now as an asset. And what that ended up doing was it inflated their profit by $60 billion. And that's a huge inflation. And in fact, it was so big that when the truth came out that that actually wasn't what happened, the stock price per stock went from $90 to less than $1 per stock. And as you can imagine, investors were really not happy about that. The second one was Tyco. Tyco was, they did fire protection, they did electronics, but they also were buying things for their people with company funds and then getting loans against those funds for the company when really it was just personal purchases, which getting those loans was totally illegal. Then when people in the company found out, they pulled them aside and said, hey, if you don't say anything, we will give you up to $106 million in what we'll call loan forgiveness. And it made it really appealing for people to not say anything, which also is illegal. So as you can probably guess, when investors found out that the company was using company funds to buy personal things and then getting loans against those personal things, well, really against the company, they weren't very happy about that, and that was a big no-no. The third one was WorldCom. WorldCom was a telecommunications company, the second largest in the US at the time, and they logged expenses as assets. And they did it so much that they misclassified $3.8 billion. And when that kind of started to not be good for the company, then they tried to offshore those assets to different companies, which were still part of the company, but on paper they were different companies, and said, oh no, we don't have these bad assets. These aren't here anymore. We sold this. When really it was still part of the company. So when investors found out about that, they weren't happy. So because of these three frauds, we had the SOX Act come into existence because the federal government said, hey, corporations need to be responsible for what they're doing. So what are the effects that we have seen from the SOX Act? First, it's an argument against the SOX Act. We've seen costs for publicly offered companies go up because not only could they not have the same company represent them for auditing and internal controls, which is an extra expense, but then with internal controls, they had to have them be big enough that they appease the federal government. But there's a big question. What's going to appease the federal government? And what's actually going to show good numbers? What they found was that was really, really costly to show specifics in something that sometimes companies just aren't so cut and dried. So to attach costs to everything, that wasn't super doable. And with internal controls, what were they going to do to prevent fraud? That costs money. So that's one of the great big arguments for SOX. One of the good things that happened because of SOX was it increased corporate responsibility, which was, the point, but corporate responsibility increased, and it has potentially lessened the amount of fraud that has happened with corporations, with financial reports. One big example is with the Wells Fargo scandal, when they had all those dummy accounts and it came out to investors that, hey, you look like you have this many accounts, but those are fraudulent. When the fraud happened and when it came out and when it was prosecuted, the CEO and the CFO, because they had both signed their names to the financial report saying, yes, I have seen this. Yes, it is accurate. Yes, it is honest. They got the penalties. They got the jail time. And the liability was theirs, instead of saying, well, I don't know who did it. That's not good enough anymore. They were prosecuted. The last thing that has been really good from the SOX Act is it has stabilized the stock market. Now, the stock market's still going to have its ups and downs as a whole, as individual stocks, but because the SOX Act has come to pass, investors now have more faith in the financial reporting, and they can say, hey, this company really is healthy. Or you know what, this company isn't. And they can make real-time decisions. Now, because of that, we can expect less turbulence. Now, like I said, there's still going to be turbulence, but it's a little bit more reliable, and at least it's reliable on its own merits and not on fraud. So those are the three main points of the SOX Act: the attributes, why it came to be, and what we've seen happen because of it. Thank you.